You should start packing after tonight. Margaret, this house won't be yours anymore, Jessica said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Right in the middle of the retirement dinner everyone had applauded just seconds before. And for a moment, the entire room seemed to freeze around her words as if time itself had hesitated to move forward. Margaret Collins, 67 years old, stood at the center of the private dining room in a mid-range steakhouse just outside Columbus, Ohio, the kind of place she and her late husband used to save for anniversaries. Her fingers still wrapped around the stem of a half-finished glass of iced tea, condensation slipping quietly down the side as her pulse echoed louder than the soft clinking of cutlery around her. And although a few guests chuckled awkwardly, assuming it was some kind of joke poorly timed, Margaret didn't laugh, because something in Jessica's tone measured, calm, almost rehearsed, felt too deliberate to be humor. Daniel, her only son, sat beside his wife, his hand resting loosely on the table, not reaching for Margaret's, not interrupting, not correcting, just staring down at his plate as if the perfectly grilled salmon in front of him demanded more attention than the sentence that had just shifted the ground beneath his mother's feet. Earlier that evening, Margaret had walked into the restaurant believing this night marked the beginning of something gentle and well-earned. 42 years as a registered nurse behind her, thousands of 12-hour shifts, countless holidays spent in hospital corridors instead of at home, all leading to this moment where she could finally exhale and trust that the life she had built would now hold her with the same care she had given others. She had even worn the navy dress Daniel had given her 5 Christmases ago, smoothing the fabric carefully before leaving the house, imagining a future filled with quiet mornings. Maybe gardening, maybe reading on the back porch, maybe Sunday dinners where laughter came easily again. The evening had started just as she hoped, a small group of colleagues sharing stories, a framed certificate presented with warm applause, Daniel giving a short toast about her dedication, though even then his words felt oddly formal, as if memorized rather than felt. And Jessica had been attentive in a way that seemed almost too polished, refilling drinks, guiding conversations, choosing when the server approached, every detail controlled with a precision Margaret hadn't noticed before tonight. Now, as the air settled uneasily after Jessica's comment, Margaret placed her glass down with careful steadiness, her movements slow, deliberate, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her hands shake. She looked at Jessica, not with anger, not yet, but with a quiet searching, as if trying to find the person she thought she knew beneath the composed exterior sitting across from her. But Jessica only tilted her head slightly, offering a small, composed smile, the kind someone gives when they believe they've said something perfectly reasonable. It's just practical, Jessica added lightly, her voice smooth, almost reassuring, as though she were explaining a minor scheduling change rather than suggesting a complete upheaval of someone's life. And still Daniel said nothing, his silence stretching longer than any explanation ever could. Margaret felt something shift deep inside her then, not a burst of emotion, not a collapse, but a slow, quiet realization, like a door opening in a dark room, revealing shapes she hadn't allowed herself to see before. The questions about the house over the past year, the casual mentions of downsizing, the times Jessica had asked about maintenance costs or property taxes with a curiosity that now seemed less innocent than she had believed. Around them, the dinner resumed in fragments, conversations restarting in low tones, forks returning to plates. But Margaret no longer heard any of it clearly, because in that moment, standing under the soft yellow lighting of a restaurant she once associated with celebration, she understood with unsettling clarity that this night was not about honoring her past. It was about setting the stage for something else entirely, something that had been quietly arranged long before she ever walked through those doors. And as she straightened her shoulders and allowed a faint, controlled smile to return to her face, Margaret Collins realized that whatever Jessica had planned, whatever Daniel had agreed to in silence, this was only the beginning of a story she had not been meant to control, but one she was no longer willing to misunderstand. Margaret did not respond to Jessica that night, not in the way anyone might have expected, because instead of asking questions or defending her place, she simply picked up her coat when the dinner ended, thanked her colleagues with a calm smile, and walked out into the cool Ohio evening air as if nothing irreversible had just been said. Yet the moment she closed the front door of her home later that night, the silence inside felt heavier than it had in years. The kind of silence that did not come from peace but from absence, from something quietly shifting beneath the surface. The house still looked exactly as it always had. The framed photographs along the hallway showing birthdays, graduations, and holidays frozen in time. Her late husband Thomas smiling in almost every frame. His presence woven into every corner of the place. And for a long moment Margaret stood in the entryway without turning on the lights, letting her eyes adjust to the faint glow coming from the street lamp outside, as if she needed to see the house this way to understand what it had become. For more than 4 decades, she had built her life around stability, around routine, waking up before sunrise for early hospital shifts, packing lunches, managing bills, making sure Daniel always had what he needed even when it meant she went without. And after Thomas passed away 6 years earlier, she had continued that same quiet discipline, maintaining the house, paying off the last of the mortgage, keeping everything in order because she believed that consistency was a form of protection, that if she held everything together tightly enough, nothing could be taken from her without her noticing. But now, standing in that dim hallway, she began to realize that some things had already been moving without her awareness. Small details she had dismissed over the past year returning to her with new clarity, like the afternoon Jessica had asked, in a tone too casual to question at the time, whether Margaret had ever considered updating her will, or the evening Daniel had offered to help organize financial documents, insisting it would make things easier in the long run, or the time she found a folder slightly out of place in her desk drawer, its contents rearranged just enough to feel unfamiliar without being obvious. At the time, Margaret had brushed these moments aside, telling herself that it was natural for a son and his wife to take an interest in practical matters, especially as she grew older. But now each memory felt less like concern and more like preparation, as though pieces had been quietly positioned long before anyone spoke openly about them. She moved slowly into the living room and sat down in her usual chair, the one Thomas used to tease her about because it faced the window instead of the television, and she folded her hands in her lap, not out of habit but out of necessity, grounding herself in something steady as her thoughts arranged themselves into a pattern she could no longer ignore. Daniel had not looked at her when Jessica spoke, not once, and that absence of eye contact carried more weight than any argument ever could, because it suggested agreement, or at the very least, acceptance. And Margaret understood then that whatever Jessica had revealed at dinner was not an impulsive remark, but the visible edge of a decision that had already been made somewhere beyond her reach. She leaned back slightly and let out a slow breath, not of defeat but of recognition, because for the first time, she was not trying to soften what she saw or explain it away. She was simply observing it as it was. And in that quiet living room, surrounded by a life she had spent decades building, Margaret Collins realized that she was no longer being included in the future others were planning, and more importantly, that she had been excluded from it for longer than she had allowed herself to believe. The next morning arrived without urgency, the kind of quiet weekday morning Margaret had imagined would feel different after retirement, slower, lighter, but instead it carried a stillness that felt deliberate, as if the house itself was waiting for her to notice something she had overlooked before. And as sunlight filtered through the kitchen blinds in thin, measured lines, she stood at the counter holding a ceramic mug of coffee that had already begun to cool, her routine unchanged yet somehow detached from the meaning it used to hold. For years, Mornings had been structured by necessity. Alarms set before dawn. Uniforms pressed and ready. A clear purpose guiding each movement. But now there was no schedule to follow. No shift to prepare for. And that absence should have felt like relief. Yet all Margaret felt was a heightened awareness of everything around her. The ticking of the wall clock. The faint hum of the refrigerator. The subtle creak of the floorboards as she moved. Details that had always existed but had never demanded her attention until now. She walked into the small home office just off the hallway. A room she had kept meticulously organized. Every file labeled. Every document placed with intention. Because order had always been her way of maintaining control. And she opened the top drawer of her desk slowly. Not with suspicion but with a quiet determination to look more closely this time. To see what she might have missed before. First glance. Everything appeared exactly as it should have been. Folders stacked neatly. Envelopes aligned. But as she lifted one file and then another, she noticed something subtle. A difference not in what was there but in how it was arranged. A sequence slightly altered. Papers that had once been grouped together now separated in a way that suggested they had been handled, reviewed, then returned without her knowledge. She paused, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of a manila folder labeled Property Documents. And for a moment she considered closing the drawer and walking away, allowing herself the comfort of uncertainty. But instead she opened it, carefully sliding the papers out and placing them on the desk in front of her. Her movements precise, controlled, as if she were back in a hospital setting where every detail mattered. She read through the documents slowly, line by line, not searching for anything specific but absorbing the information with a clarity sharpened by last night's realization. And it did not take long before she found what felt out of place. A small notation near the bottom of one page. A reference to a recent inquiry regarding ownership structure. Dated just 3 weeks earlier. A date she recognized not because of the document itself but because it coincided with a weekend Daniel and Jessica had visited, offering to help her get things organized. A phrase that now echoed in her mind with a different weight. Margaret set the paper down gently and leaned back in her chair. Her expression unchanged, her breathing steady. Yet inside, the pattern continued to form, each piece aligning with the next in a way that left little room for doubt, because this was not a misunderstanding, not a simple miscommunication. This was a process, one that had been unfolding quietly, methodically, with her position just outside of its center. She stood up and walked back into the kitchen, placing the untouched coffee in the sink without hesitation, as if the act itself symbolized a shift she was not yet ready to name. And as she looked around the room, at the cabinets she had painted herself years ago, at the table where countless meals had been shared, she felt a calm settle over her. Not the kind that comes from reassurance but the kind that follows acceptance. Because for the first time, Margaret Collins was no longer trying to convince herself that everything was as it had always been. She was beginning to understand that something had already changed, and more importantly, that she needed to see just how far that change had gone. Margaret did not call Daniel that day, and she did not confront Jessica, because something in her told her that speaking too soon would only confirm what they expected of her, that she would react emotionally, ask questions without answers, and ultimately place herself in a position where everything could be explained away. So instead she chose something far quieter, far more deliberate, and by mid-morning she had changed into a light gray coat and driven across town to the same local bank she had used for over 30 years. The familiar brick building standing unchanged on the corner, as if nothing inside it could possibly have shifted without her knowledge. When she stepped through the glass doors, the soft chime above her sounded exactly as it always had, and the scent of polished floors and paper greeted her with a sense of routine that felt almost reassuring. Yet beneath that surface familiarity, Margaret carried a different kind of awareness, one that sharpened her attention to every glance, every hesitation, every word spoken or left unsaid. She approached the front desk and asked, in a calm and even tone, to review her accounts, and the young teller nodded politely before directing her to a small office where a branch associate named Karen greeted her with a practiced smile, the kind that was warm but measured. And as Margaret sat down across from her, she folded her hands neatly in her lap, her posture composed, her expression neutral, giving no indication that anything unusual had brought her there. "I would like to go over my account activity from the past few months," she said, her voice steady, and Karen began to pull up the information on her computer, her fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. But there was a moment, brief yet noticeable, when her eyes paused on the screen just a fraction longer than expected, a flicker of something that Margaret recognized not as confusion but as awareness. The documents were printed and placed in front of her, and Margaret reviewed them carefully, line by line, just as she had done with the papers at home, her attention catching on a series of transactions that were not incorrect but unfamiliar, administrative changes, minor adjustments, the addition of a secondary contact name that appeared in small, formal text near the bottom of one page. And although the name itself did not surprise her, seeing it there, officially recorded, carried a weight that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. She lifted her gaze and met Karen's eyes, not with accusation but with quiet clarity, and asked, "When was this update made?" And Karen hesitated again, just for a second, before answering, "About 3 weeks ago, Mum. It looks like the request came through with proper authorization." The words spoken carefully, each one chosen with precision, as if she were aware that she was stepping into something she did not fully understand. Margaret nodded slowly, her expression unchanged, though inside, the timeline aligned too perfectly with everything she had begun to piece together. And she did not ask who had submitted the request, because she already knew. Instead, she simply gathered the papers, thanked Karen with the same polite tone she had used her entire life, and stood to leave, her movements unhurried, controlled, as if nothing significant had been confirmed in that small office. Outside, the air felt cooler than it had that morning, a faint breeze moving through the trees along the street, and Margaret paused beside her car for a moment, looking out across the parking lot without really seeing it, because what mattered was no longer in front of her but behind her, in the quiet sequence of actions that had taken place without her full awareness. And as she opened the driver's door and settled into the seat, she understood with a calm certainty that whatever Jessica had revealed at dinner was not a suggestion or a possibility. It was the final step in something that had already begun, and Margaret Collins, for the first time, was no longer trying to stop it. She was preparing to understand it completely. Margaret did not drive straight home after leaving the bank. Instead, she turned onto a quieter street lined with older oak trees, the kind that had been there long before any of the surrounding houses were built, and she parked along the curb without turning off the engine, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel as she allowed the silence inside the car to settle around her, not as an escape but as a space where her thoughts could move without interruption. The documents she had collected sat neatly on the passenger seat, untouched since she left the bank, yet their presence felt heavier than their physical weight, because they no longer represented information, they represented confirmation. And Margaret understood now that what had once felt like isolated concerns had become a pattern she could trace with unsettling clarity. She thought back to the first time Jessica had suggested that the house might be too much for her to manage alone. The comment delivered with a soft tone and a sympathetic smile, framed as concern rather than intention, and how Daniel had nodded quietly beside her, adding that maybe a smaller place would be more practical. A word that now echoed differently in Margaret's mind, stripped of its gentle disguise. At the time, Margaret had responded with patience, explaining that she was comfortable, that the house was paid off, that she had no plans to leave, and they had accepted her answer without argument, or at least that was how it had seemed. But now she could see that their silence had not been agreement, it had been calculation, a pause while they adjusted their approach. She turned off the engine and stepped out of the car, the late morning air cool against her skin, and for a moment she simply stood there, looking at nothing in particular, because what she was seeing was not the quiet street in front of her, but the sequence of conversations, gestures, and decisions that had unfolded over the past year, each one subtle enough to overlook on its own, yet together forming something deliberate, something coordinated. Margaret returned to the driver's seat and picked up the papers, her eyes moving once more over the lines that confirmed the addition of a secondary contact, the inquiry into ownership, the quiet administrative steps that had been taken without her full understanding, and she realized that Jessica had not acted alone, because these actions required more than suggestion. They required access, cooperation, and most importantly, permission. And that permission could only have come from Daniel. The thought did not arrive with anger. It arrived with a kind of clarity that felt almost detached, as if she were observing someone else's situation rather than her own, because anger would have clouded her judgment, and Margaret was no longer willing to misunderstand what was happening by reacting too quickly. Instead, she placed the documents back on the passenger seat and started the car again, her movements steady, her expression unchanged, because she knew now that the situation in front of her was not about a single conversation at dinner. It was about a series of decisions that had already been made, steps that had already been taken, and a future that had been quietly outlined without her involvement. As she drove home, the familiar streets of her neighborhood seemed different, not because they had changed but because her perspective had. And when she pulled into her driveway and turned off the engine once more, Margaret Collins understood something with complete certainty, that whatever Jessica believed she had revealed that night was not the beginning of anything. It was simply the moment Margaret finally saw the full shape of what had been happening all along. And that realization did not leave her feeling powerless. It left her with a quiet, steady resolve to decide what she would do next. Margaret did not rush into action when she stepped back into her house that afternoon, because she understood now that whatever had been set in motion around her had not been built in a single moment, and it would not be undone by one either. So instead she moved through her home with the same quiet precision she had used for decades, hanging her coat carefully, placing her keys in their usual spot, allowing everything to appear unchanged even as her awareness sharpened with each step. She walked once more into her office and sat down at her desk, the documents from the bank now placed neatly in front of her. And for a long moment she did not touch them. She simply observed them, as if seeing them as part of a larger picture rather than isolated evidence. And then she reached for a different folder, one she had not opened in months, labeled in her own handwriting from years ago, containing copies of legal documents she and Thomas had arranged together long before illness had entered their lives. As she opened it, the faint scent of old paper rose into the air, familiar and grounding, and she began to read through the contents slowly, her eyes moving steadily across each page, recalling the conversations she and Thomas had shared when they first created these documents, conversations about protection, about clarity, about ensuring that no matter what happened, their intentions would remain intact. At the time, those discussions had felt like distant precautions, something responsible but not urgent. Yet now, sitting alone in the quiet room, Margaret could feel the weight of those decisions in a way she had not before, because they were no longer theoretical. They were relevant, immediate, and possibly the only boundary between what had been planned and what could actually be done. She turned another page and paused, her fingers resting lightly along the edge, as she recognized a clause she had not thought about in years, something Thomas had insisted on including despite her initial hesitation, a provision that defined ownership and control in terms that were far more specific than she had realized at the time. And as she read it again, carefully, line by line, a subtle shift moved through her understanding. Not sudden, not dramatic, but steady, like a light gradually illuminating a room that had been dim. Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair, her expression unchanged, but inside, the structure of the situation began to rearrange itself, because what Jessica and Daniel had been working toward depended on assumptions, on access, on the belief that Margaret either did not know or would not question the details, and for a long time, that belief had been correct. But now it was no longer accurate. She closed the folder gently and placed it beside the bank documents, aligning them with deliberate care, because in that moment, she was no longer reacting to what had been discovered. She was considering what it meant, and more importantly, what it allowed. Outside, a car passed slowly along the street, its tires rolling over the pavement with a soft, distant sound, and Margaret turned her head slightly toward the window, not to look at the street but to acknowledge the world continuing as it always did, unaffected by the quiet shifts taking place inside her home. And then she returned her attention to the desk, her posture straight, her hands resting calmly in front of her, because for the first time since that night at dinner, she was not focused on what had been taken from her, or what had been planned without her. She was focused on what remained firmly within her control, and Margaret Collins understood then, with a calm certainty that did not require words, that she did not need to confront anyone yet. She did not need to explain what she knew, because the most important thing at this moment was not revealing the truth. It was fully understanding the position she still held, and how she intended to use it. Margaret waited 3 days before calling Daniel, not because she needed time to decide what she felt, but because she needed to see whether anything would change on its own, whether there would be a call, a visit, some small attempt to soften what had been said that night. But there was nothing, only the quiet continuation of normal routines, as if the conversation at dinner had been insignificant. And when she finally dialed his number on a Thursday afternoon, she did so with the same calm precision she had carried through every step since, her tone steady when he answered, her words simple as she asked if he and Jessica could come by that evening because she wanted to talk. Daniel agreed without hesitation, his voice neutral, almost relieved, as if this was the conversation he had been expecting. And when they arrived just after 6 o'clock, Jessica stepped into the house first, her expression composed, her posture confident, scanning the familiar living room with a brief glance that felt less like curiosity and more like assessment, while Daniel followed behind her, offering his mother a small, restrained smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Margaret invited them to sit, choosing the same chairs they had used countless times before, maintaining the ordinary setting as if this were just another family visit. And for a few moments, they spoke about trivial things, the weather, Daniel's work schedule, a neighbor who had recently moved away, the kind of surface conversation that filled space without meaning, until Margaret allowed the silence to settle naturally between them, not forcing it, simply letting it arrive. Then she spoke, her voice even, without accusation, without emotion, asking a single question that did not need to be raised in volume to carry its weight. When did you start making decisions about my house? And the effect was immediate, not dramatic, but unmistakable. As Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, his hands coming together in a way that suggested discomfort, while Jessica did not look surprised at all, instead leaning back slightly, her expression unchanged, as if the question had been anticipated, Daniel began to respond, his words careful, explaining that they were only trying to help, that they had been thinking about what would be best for her, that the house might be difficult to maintain. Phrases that sounded reasonable when spoken slowly, yet carried a rehearsed quality that made them feel less like explanations and more like prepared statements, and Margaret listened without interruption, her gaze steady, allowing him to finish before she turned her attention to Jessica. "And you?" she asked quietly, and Jessica met her eyes without hesitation, her voice calm, almost reassuring, as she said that they had simply been planning ahead, that it made sense to consider options, that everything was meant to be practical and efficient, words that mirrored what had been said at dinner, now delivered with the same composed confidence. Margaret nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging the logic of what she was hearing, yet her silence carried something different now, something that neither of them seemed able to interpret clearly, because she was no longer trying to understand their intentions, she already had, and instead she was observing how openly they would confirm what had been done. Daniel glanced at Jessica briefly, as if looking for direction, and in that small moment, Margaret saw the dynamic with a clarity that removed any remaining doubt, because the decisions had not only been shared, they had been guided, shaped, and carried forward with a level of certainty that left little room for hesitation. Margaret folded her hands in her lap and leaned back slightly, her posture relaxed, her expression calm, and for a moment she said nothing at all, allowing the weight of the conversation to settle fully in the room, because what mattered was no longer what they would admit or deny. It was the fact that everything she needed to know had already been revealed, not through confrontation, but through the quiet consistency of their words and actions. And as she looked at them both sitting in her living room, speaking about her future as if it were a shared project, Margaret Collins understood that the conversation she had waited to have was not about uncovering the truth, it was about confirming it. And now that it had been confirmed, she could finally decide what came next. Margaret did not raise her voice, and she did not argue, because by the time Daniel and Jessica finished explaining what they believed was reasonable, she had already moved beyond the need to convince them of anything, and instead she stood up slowly from her chair and walked toward her office without asking them to follow, trusting that they would, because people who believe they are in control rarely hesitate to see a plan through. The soft sound of their footsteps behind her confirmed exactly that, measured and unhurried, as if they expected the next part of the conversation to move in the direction they had already imagined. And when Margaret reached her desk, she did not rush. She simply opened the drawer and took out the same folder she had reviewed earlier, placing it carefully on the surface before turning back to face them. Daniel looked uncertain now, his earlier composure beginning to shift, while Jessica remained still, her expression composed but more focused, as if recalculating rather than reacting. And Margaret noticed this without acknowledging it, because what mattered was not how they felt in that moment, but what they would understand next. She opened the folder and removed a set of documents, smoothing them out with deliberate care before speaking, her tone steady, clear, and without any trace of confrontation. "You both have been planning based on certain assumptions," she said, not accusing, simply stating, and Daniel shifted again, glancing briefly at Jessica, while Jessica's gaze remained fixed on the papers in Margaret's hands. "The house," Margaret continued, "was never transferred the way you seem to believe," and she turned one of the documents toward them, allowing the printed text to face outward. Though she did not push it forward or demand that they take it, she simply made it visible, letting the information exist between them without force. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his eyes scanning the page, his brow tightening as he read, while Jessica's posture remained composed but her attention sharpened, her calm now carrying a subtle tension that had not been there before. Margaret did not explain immediately. She allowed the silence to stretch, because silence, she understood, often revealed more than words. And when she spoke again, her voice was quieter, but firmer. "Your father and I made very specific arrangements years ago," she said, referencing Thomas without sentimentality, simply as fact. "And those arrangements do not change because someone makes a request at a bank or asks the right questions." And for the first time, Daniel looked directly at her, confusion replacing the quiet agreement he had carried before, as if the structure he thought he understood was no longer stable. Jessica finally spoke then, her voice still controlled, but less certain than before, asking what exactly Margaret meant. And Margaret met her gaze without hesitation, not with hostility, but with a calm clarity that did not need emphasis. "It means," she said, "that nothing you have been preparing for can happen the way you think it will." And she let that sentence settle fully before adding anything more. Daniel leaned back slightly, his hands no longer steady, while Jessica's expression tightened just enough to reveal that the certainty she had carried into the room was beginning to shift. Not collapsing, but adjusting, recalculating. Margaret closed the folder gently, placing her hand on top of it as if to anchor the conversation in something solid, and she did not continue with details. She did not outline consequences or explain every clause, because she understood that the power of the moment did not come from overwhelming them with information. It came from changing the direction of what they believed was possible. The room grew quiet again, not with the same uncertainty as before, but with a different kind of awareness, one that no longer centered on what Margaret did not know, but on what she did. And as she looked at both of them sitting across from her, Margaret Collins remained completely composed, because the truth she had uncovered was no longer something she was trying to understand, it was something she now controlled. And that control did not need to be announced loudly, it only needed to be shown once, clearly enough that it could not be ignored. Margaret did not continue speaking after that, because she understood that anything more would lessen the weight of what had already been said. And instead she simply stepped back from the desk and returned to her seat in the living room, leaving the folder closed, not as a secret but as a boundary, something that no longer needed to be explained in detail to be understood. Daniel remained standing for a moment before slowly sitting down, his posture no longer relaxed, his gaze shifting between his mother and the space in front of him, as if trying to reconcile what he had believed with what had just been revealed. While Jessica stayed where she was, her expression controlled but no longer composed in the same effortless way, the slight tension in her jaw and the stillness of her hands betraying a recalculation that she could not fully conceal. The room felt different now, not because anything had physically changed, but because the balance within it had shifted. The assumptions that had once filled the space replaced by a quiet awareness that nothing was as straightforward as it had seemed. Margaret folded her hands loosely in her lap, her posture relaxed, her breathing steady, and for a moment she allowed the silence to exist without interruption, because she knew that silence, when it followed certainty, did more than any argument ever could. Daniel finally spoke, his voice quieter than before, asking what this meant going forward, not with the same confidence he had carried into the house, but with a hesitation that suggested he was no longer sure of his place within the situation. And Margaret looked at him with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with a clarity that did not soften itself for comfort. "It means," she said evenly, "that nothing changes unless I decide it does." And she did not raise her voice. She did not emphasize the words. She simply stated them, allowing their meaning to settle without resistance. Jessica shifted slightly then, her composure returning in measured increments as she attempted to regain control of the conversation, suggesting that they were only trying to help, that they were thinking about what would be best for everyone. But the words no longer carried the same weight they had before, because the foundation beneath them had been removed. And Margaret did not respond to the argument itself, she simply listened, her silence now deliberate, no longer passive but active, a refusal to engage on terms that had already been redefined. After a moment, Daniel stood up, the movement uncertain, as if he was no longer sure whether staying would clarify anything further, and Jessica followed, her posture straight, her expression composed once again, though now it held a different kind of focus, one that acknowledged resistance rather than assumed compliance. Margaret walked them to the door without hurry, without ceremony, and when Daniel paused as if to say something more, she gave him a small, polite nod that ended the moment before it could expand into something unnecessary. The door closed quietly behind them, the sound soft but final, and Margaret stood in the entryway for a few seconds, not moving, not reflecting, simply allowing the stillness to settle back into the house. Then she turned and walked into the living room, the same room that had held so many conversations over the years, and she sat down in her chair facing the window, the late evening light stretching across the floor in long, quiet lines, and for the first time since that night at dinner, there was no uncertainty left in her thoughts, no unanswered question pulling at her attention, because everything that had been hidden was now visible, everything that had been assumed was now understood, and Margaret Collins did not feel the need to explain herself, to defend her decisions, or to correct anyone else's expectations, because the only thing that mattered was that she knew exactly where she stood, and she intended to remain there, not with resistance, not with force, but with a quiet, unwavering certainty that did not require anyone else's agreement to be real.